On behalf of McKissick Museum and the University and the College of Arts and Sciences, we thank you so much for joining us this evening for our celebration. We are celebrating the life and work of Toby Morriss. And here to speak to you tonight about this exhibit is Eric Plaag. And Eric was a student of Toby's and a very dear friend. Eric Plaag.
Thank you, Janae. First, I want to say thank you to Lynn Robertson and all of the McKissick Museum staff for their generosity in hosting this exhibit. Shortly after Toby died, Toby's parents and I talked about what we should do with all this photography, this beautiful set of images that we knew were not only some of them in our possession, but also a whole bunch more out in the world. And we decided pretty quickly that we wanted to find a place that was appropriate to show as much of that photography as we could gather. One of the challenges to that was that, well, two things really. Toby kept almost no records generally in life, but specifically about his photography. And so the question of where it was from the beginning a difficult one to answer. But second, Toby often at the end of an exhibition would have maybe a dozen pieces or 8 pieces left over from 15 or 10 that he'd shown. And he noticed someone standing in front of one of the images and he'd say, "Oh, you like that?" And they'd say, "Yeah, this is just beautiful." He'd say, "Oh, it's yours, go ahead, take it." And so there would be no record of who walked off with whatever piece of photography. So finding the work was a daunting task. It helped that because Toby and I were so close, I knew a lot of his people. And so there was a lot of mass emailing, "Please, if you have any Toby art, email me back." And I heard from a lot of people and spent a good part of my spring and summer traveling all over the United States collecting Toby art to bring back specifically for this exhibition. I was also left with going through what Toby had left behind in his own possession, a lot of which had not been framed or had not ever been shown in a gallery setting, but that was intended to be final work for whatever series he was working on. And a large portion of that body of work had survived Katrina. And by survived, I don't mean that it came through it well. I mean that it's still around even in spite of Katrina. And so that meant doing some restoration to it. It meant framing it in a lot of cases. It meant trying to figure out what the best way of presenting it would be. I'd like to talk about a few key pieces here in the gallery. There are text panels to help you generally with the work, and I'll leave you to explore those on your own. But I think there's some specific images that get at some of the challenges in putting together this exhibition, but also at who Toby was as a photographer. And I'll start with this piece here, which was an untitled piece, and which I've chosen with consultation with the Morrisses to call Bison at Tallgrass Prairie. Now, you may notice that almost all of the photography that you see here doesn't have glass over it. And that's because Toby felt very strongly that glass was a boundary between his work and you as the viewer that didn't need to be there. And so he rarely, if ever, put glass over his images. There is one notable exception, which we'll come to a little later, called the inconspicuous truce prototype over in that corner, but I'll talk about that in a few moments. But much of his work appeared either mounted to the edge, like the pieces in the Leaves of Grass series on this wall, or matted, window matted, but with no glass over the image at all. This has proven to be a bit of a challenge in a curatorial sense, because we've already seen people who will walk in and touch it and do all kinds of interesting things. And you know, photos don't really like fingers. We all know this, but for some reason, people like to go touch because it's really fascinating stuff. Especially a textured piece like Two Brothers, which is out in the hallway, where Toby cut the image up into what look like little puzzle pieces and put it back together. With this piece, though, this was an interesting find because Toby had never shown this piece. And in fact, he'd begun to experiment with this piece at some point in the past, taking a duplicate copy of this print and actually crumbling it up getting it wet after he crumbled it up, letting it sit for a while like that, and then pulling it back apart. Why in the world, you ask, would a photographer do that to his work? Well, we're going to come to another piece a little bit further on, over on the far gallery wall, where he used that same technique. And my belief is that Toby experimented first with this image before doing that one. Now, I chose to show this not in its wrinkled state because in and of itself, the image is a beautiful image that I know Toby liked a lot. It's also an image that's, I think, perhaps most representational of who Toby was, both as a photographer and as a person. The Tallgrass Prairie in northeast Oklahoma is owned by the Nature Conservancy, excuse me. And it's an area of grassland prairie that is one of the few remaining untouched grassland prairie reserves in the country. Because his family lives near there, he made frequent trips to this location and photographed there probably on an annual basis. This image, which we believe was taken in 2003, is indicative of Toby's focus on his connection with the land, but also the connection he believed we all have to the land and to nature. As you'll see in this section, Toby really did have a love affair with the natural world, and that's evident throughout his work. I'd like to move down this way, and I realize it's a large crowd, but if you can sort of wander with me, that would be great. And there's two sides. You can fill in on this side if you want to. From 2003 to 2005, Toby was experimenting in one of his more productive periods. Not that there were unproductive periods, but he was churning out a huge body of work during these 3 years, partially because he was in graduate school at that time and had the time to explore lots of different issues through this particular theme that he was focusing on, and that's what he called liminalism. And he was interested in this question of the space between what is known and unknown, what is identifiable and what is not identifiable. And I didn't realize this until I started to put the show together, how much of Toby's work was really a reflection of the issues that he was trying to figure out about himself, both as a person and as an artist. And I can imagine, I don't know this for sure, but I can imagine that as he was coming to the end of this graduate program in a field that probably 5 years earlier he had not thought he was going to be entering and exploring on a full-time basis, that he was trying to figure out who he was as an artist and what his place was in the artistic world, as well as what his place as Toby was in the rest of the world. And so he explored this through two sets of work that were displayed as part of his thesis exhibition. The first was a series of 6 photographs, 5 of which were in light boxes, 1 above, 4 surrounding, hung by cables, and then an unlit panel on the ground. The unlit panel, when you stood over it, you realized was Toby's feet. And it was him standing in the midst of the bayou, and the bayou surrounding him, and the sky above. And he titled it Self-Portrait. Now, this appeared in a darkened room, which is why this part of the gallery is darker than the rest, so you can get a sense of what this must have looked like when it was on display. We know where 2 of the light boxes are, and they're right here. We do not know where the rest of them are. We know that the headpiece was sold to a man in New Orleans who bought it to put over his daughter's bed, but we have no idea where the rest is. That's typical of Toby's work. Now, one of these pieces was given to Toby's parents shortly after the show, and so it's in remarkably good condition. The other piece hung around in New Orleans, and it was shortly after this exhibition in 2005 that Toby had to very quickly pack up what he could of his own belongings, as well as the animals of two of his closest friends, and pile them along with his girlfriend's belongings into a car and flee as quickly as he could shortly before Katrina arrived in New Orleans. Once they were here in Columbia, where Toby's girlfriend's family lived, they realized pretty quickly they weren't going back to New Orleans to stay. And so a lot of his work sat for months in a building at Tulane. It was unair conditioned, not climate controlled in any way, partially flooded, and presumably moved around a little bit during those months. And as a result, the work that stayed behind, a lot of it was damaged. So for example, these 5 panels, which are from the other half of this thesis exhibition, show some of that damage. It was a difficult choice to make about whether to show these. Because typically when you're doing a retrospective or a celebration of someone's work, you don't say, all right, we're the really crappy pieces that have all kinds of bad stuff happening to them because I want to show those. But in this instance, it's part of Toby's story. And so I think the damage is such that you can get a sense of what he was aiming for, and at the same time realize that it's a reflection of how this one event radically altered his life. Now, it's that event that brought him to Columbia. And it's that event that forced him to rethink how he was going to live the rest of his life and what he was going to do next. When he got here, he quickly made friends in town, quickly found a position teaching here at USC, quickly found a position working for Machinery and Design Company, which is a motorcycle repair shop out in Lexington. And at the same time, a lot of things were transitioning in Toby's life beyond the obvious. And so he produced 2 series that you see as we head this way. The first of these is a series that runs along this long wall up to the large poster in the center, which was his Finding My Place series. The other was the facade series that you see on the back side of these intermediate walls in the center. Now, I didn't know Toby until the fall of 2006. I'd met him briefly in the spring. Actually, didn't care for him all that much. It's a funny story, but not one we have time for here. But the essence of it was that he looked over my shoulder as I was working on developing my own photography and said some things that my initial reaction was, who asked you? And, later, he sort of endeared himself to me, and by the fall, he and I was his student in one of his photography classes. My mom died that fall, and our conversations centering around the catharsis I was seeking through my work about my mom's death, I think really sealed our friendship. And so we became very fast and very close friends. We would travel a lot together on various road trips. And the Facade series is actually the product of 2 road trips that Toby and I took together. The first was by car to Atlanta when we were going to actually see an exhibition at a gallery in Atlanta. The second was a trip we took by train from here to Washington, D.C. In both instances, I didn't know what he was up to, but he kept aiming his camera out the window and taking pictures as we're flying along at 65 miles an hour. And of course, being the very rigid and static person that I am in my own work, all I'm thinking is, dude, that's going to be really blurry. I don't know why you're taking that picture. Have fun, but you know what you're doing. So when he was done, he produced, obviously, these beautiful blurred images that really are about facades. And I think when you pick up one of the brochures where Toby talks about his different series, and you look specifically at the one about facades, I think you'll get a sense of how much his artist statements are revealing about him. And this is from a guy who didn't reveal a lot, actually, about himself through words to other people. And the thing that strikes me about the Facade series is that I could sense as his friend this turmoil underneath his surface that was going on. He was not happy here. He did not want to be here. He knew that Columbia was not the place for him to be. And yet at the same time, there were so many good things happening for him here. He had very good and close friends here. He had a good job, 2 good jobs, really. And he couldn't reconcile those things. And so he had the facade of the life that he was living that was a very happy life, along with this turmoil underneath of wanting to be somewhere else. And that series is really all about that. Let's wander all the way down to the far end of the gallery. I'm going to talk about two pieces down there, and then I'll wrap up and take any questions you might have. I'd like to stop here first in front of this image. My government required 15 minutes of television watching for today. It's a smaller image, so I know it's difficult for those of you who are farther back to see. But it's an image of a television sitting in the surf. And I've had people ask me, where do you find the television? Or, that's really cool, but kind of staged. I mean, what's that all about? And unless you know the backstory, you might conclude from this that maybe some of the other images you see here are somehow staged. Toby didn't stage his work. He photographed what he found in the world. And believe it or not, during the 2007 LumCon, and if you're not familiar with what that is, it's described elsewhere in here, but the Louisiana University's Marine Consortium holds a coastal landscape photography course every year down in coastal Louisiana. The purpose of that course is to collect images that document the rapid change taking place in Louisiana's coastlines. That change is on the order of 3 football fields worth of land disappearing daily. That's how quickly the erosion is happening in that part of our country. And so what they do is they gather these images and save them to document how the landscape is changing. As one example, I believe it's Wine Island, which at one time in 2007 and through 2008 was a nature preserve, now no longer exists. It's all water. There's nothing else there. So while we were there for this course and going out to these various barrier islands, we were on one particular island and walking along the beach, and we came to a television. Now, I will tell you that it was not face up. I will admit that. But he propped it up, and Jenny Prather, who's here tonight, and another friend of ours sat with Toby and watched TV for a while, even though there was nothing on it, and had lots of laughs about that, and then he started taking some pictures. Now, you might be wondering, why is a television on the coast of Louisiana? This is by far one of the tamer things that you find washed up on the beach in coastal Louisiana. In fact, it's very dangerous to walk without shoes, and I mean solid shoes, when you're on the Louisiana beaches. The amount of debris that washes up, much of it thrown off of oil platforms, dumped overboard by ships passing through the Gulf, or the detritus of various hurricanes that have come through and washed stuff out to shore that then has to wash back into shore, is amazing. And I saw things that I didn't think could exist out in the natural world on their own, washed up on beaches. This also was not the only television we found on that one island, believe it or not. I believe there were a total of 3 that we came across. This was one in the best shape. I bring up this image for 2 reasons. One, to make it clear that Toby did photograph things as he found them. There was nothing directorial, if you're familiar with that term in photography, about what he did. He didn't stage his shots. He didn't hire people to stand in particular places. He didn't do any of that nonsense. He found what he found in the world and photographed it. But it also gets to something that was very important to Toby, which is the way in which we are abusing our world. And he wanted to find a way, through a medium that is actually in itself somewhat abusive to the world, he wanted to find a way to document the effect that we have upon our land and our water. You may wonder what I'm talking about when I say that photography is abusive to the world. Well, he's using, in the silver gelatin process that you see here, a fairly tame process as photography processes go. But in the end, when you're dealing with chemicals that have to remove silver from the image so that you can complete the development process, all that silver has to go somewhere. Silver is a heavy metal. It ends up in our waterways. It ends up in the fish that we eat. It's not a good thing. But he would do whatever he could to try to get around that problem to lessen the impact of his photography. And he made a very calculated decision that the benefit of what he was doing outweighed whatever damage he was doing through that art. I think where he was headed is best explored in this image over here that I mentioned to you earlier. It's called "And We Used the Sea Until It Became as Leather." This is the image that I mentioned previously that he had printed, then taken while it was still wet, balled it up, and let it sit for a while. He then smoothed it out and toned it with a process that can also be fairly toxic to the environment, but it created exactly the type of image that he wanted you to see. He wanted to explain to you that this is very much what we're doing to our natural world through our daily activities, and particularly what we're doing to the oceans. It was around the time that he made this image that he began to realize that water was his muse. And Water is My Georgia is the piece that you see here. It's a very small piece, but as he was developing this image, he realized how much it looked like some of Georgia O'Keeffe's art, and the Yonic qualities. I guess that's the PG-13 version that I'll use to describe it. The Yonic qualities of her work. And so he began thinking about Georgia O'Keeffe and her relationships to Stieglitz, who was a very famous early American photographer, and how water was to him like Georgia O'Keeffe was to Stieglitz, a muse. Because as you can see from this whole wall over here and through many of the other images, he loved photographing water. During the last 3 years, he was focusing on how to capture that without taking more of what he'd already done, just images of waves crashing, for example. And he began playing around with pinhole cameras. The two cameras you see here, the one on the left is Penny. Penny is a somewhat traditional pinhole camera. There's nothing fancy in it in terms of extra things going on. It's just a long exposure camera. And I don't know if you're familiar with pinhole cameras, but this one was capable, for example, of doing a 25-minute long exposure in broad daylight. Now, when you think about how long the shutter speed normally is on your cameras when you take a snapshot, maybe 1/60th of a second compared to 25 minutes, you get an idea of how small that hole is and how little light is coming through onto the film. But what it does allow you to do is capture the motion of whatever it is you're photographing. And so many of the images that you see on this wall are images that were taken with Penny to capture that effect of the motion. The other camera you see is called Inconspicuous Truce. And as you can see with the setup here, we have again a pinhole box camera, but mounted on top is a digital video camera. Now, Toby was someone who really disliked digital photography. I think that's being nice. He called digital photography the great lie. Now, people would sometimes respond to that by saying, well, Toby, you can manipulate the analog image in the darkroom just as much as somebody on Photoshop can play around with other things. He said, it's not the same. Whatever I capture on the film, it's there in the negative. I haven't added anything to it. I haven't taken anything away from it. It's only about the amount of time when I put my paper underneath the enlarger as to what shows up on that paper. But he'd begun to realize that maybe there was a little bit of a truce that could be struck between the digital world and the analog world that he loved to work in. And so he mounted his digital camera to the top of this pinhole camera. And while this was making, in this instance, a 4-minute and 14-second exposure, the digital camera, the video component to it, would also be running. And so he shot a number of locations that were intended to be presented like this, where you have on the left the image from the 4 minutes and 14 seconds on the analog negative, and then him printing that. And on the right, the actual movement in a video sense, a digital video sense, of what he was photographing. What I find interesting about this piece, and this is the only one that he had time to make of the many places that he shot before he died. And it's sort of creative what he did. He went out and bought a digital picture frame, the kind where you can run video through it and it'll play for as long as you want, and it's all electronic. He gutted the thing, took the sound card out, and made it work exactly the way he wanted it to, and mounted it to the back of a traditional picture frame. What's interesting about this piece, though, is the reaction that people have when they see it. They stand in front of it and they stare. And he had never shown this piece publicly. It was a gift he made for his parents. And I really wish that he could be here to see the reaction of people when they come to the gallery, especially when they're alone, and just spend 5 minutes sitting in front of it. I think it really gets at the heart of what he was trying to say about this strange balance that could be struck between video and digital video at that, and the analog process. So, I want to conclude by telling you what SilverYana is, since that's the name of our exhibit. You may be wondering a little bit about that. As I mentioned earlier, Toby was not happy with life in Columbia. He'd been hoping that, among other things, that a tenure track position would open up at USC, and given the realities of South Carolina budgeting, that wasn't going to happen anytime soon. So he began thinking about other ways that he could make his living as a photographer. He applied to a lot of jobs throughout the country. He was hoping to relocate to the desert Southwest, which is one of his favorite places in the country. But as he was going through that process, he became kind of disillusioned with this idea of running on the academic treadmill and trying to do what so many other artists do in order to sustain themselves. And he realized that what he really wanted to be doing was combining his love of teaching and his desire to teach with something that was going to practically benefit the world beyond just educating people. And so he had come up with the idea of the SilverYana Foundation. The idea of the SilverYana Foundation was that it would take people interested in learning darkroom photography out to sites that were underrepresented or neglected natural resource and historical resource facilities. And he would spend a week to 2 weeks at that site, allowing the people in his class to photograph whatever they wanted while they were at that site, with the understanding that at the end of that time, they would give their images to the site, the people managing the site where he had taken them. And so that those people could use those images in whatever way they wanted to in order to help protect those natural and historical resources. The first of those experiences was supposed to happen June of this year. Toby's family and I are working together to figure out how to make SilverYana still happen. But that was Toby's goal. That was the thing that he was aiming to do before he died. What questions can I answer for you? And please ask if you have questions.
You want to explain the name?
Yes, SilverYana refers to, obviously, the silver gelatin process for the first part. And the word yana means journey, often a spiritual one, in Zen Buddhism and various other Eastern traditions. Other questions? Surely you have questions.
How long did you know him?
I met him in fall of 2006, so just under 4 years.
What kind of things can the community do that you would appreciate the most to help your goals as far as making his goals?
Sure. Wow. Great question. I don't know that I know how to answer it tonight. As I mentioned, the family and I are working together to figure out the best way to make that foundation and that field photography experience happen. It's something that's important to us. One of the challenges we have is finding someone who shares a similar set of skills as what Toby had, who is able to communicate that same type of vision to the students in that class. We've talked about some individuals that we might ask to do that, but it means making them available in order to give their lives to 8 experiences a year, which is what we planned. The other thing that we want to do is obviously preserve as much of Toby's work as we can and continue to present it to a wider community. And that's just going to take time and funding. We have not yet formally set up the SilverYana Foundation, but obviously when that time comes, we would welcome any help that people can give to making that happen. Yes, sir. I'm sorry, ma'am.
That's okay. It doesn't matter. On his card, it says thinker, photographer, mechanic, and bricoleur. What is bricoleur?
Well, if Toby would hear, he'd say, look it up. But I am not so mean, I will not say no. A bricoleur is someone who takes the resources that are available to him or her and uses them to make something new and inventive. It's the easiest way I can describe it to you. It's someone who uses all the, think of MacGyver, and you have the idea of a bricoleur, if you know who MacGyver is. So, other questions? All right, well, thank you very much for coming out to see Toby's work and for being here for our reception. Please, there's lots of food out there. Jessica Plaag, Jessica Plaag, who made the amazing Toby cupcake mosaic out there that people have been admiring and awing over and wondering precisely how it was done. She has begged me to ask you to please eat some chocolate chai cupcakes because she does not have room for 500 cupcakes in her house. So please have at it. Help yourselves to whatever food you want, and thank you again.